when I plead with thee, yet let me talk with thee of thy judgment. Wherefore doth the way of the wicked prosper? Wherefore are all they happy that deal very treacherously? Thou hast planted them, yea, they have taken root. They grow, yea, they bring forth fruit. Thou art near in their mouth, and far from their reins. But thou, O Lord, knowest me. Thou hast seen me, and tried mine heart toward thee. Pull them out like sheep for the slaughter, and prepare them for the day of slaughter. How long shall the land mourn, and the herbs of every field wither, for the wickedness of them that dwell therein? The beasts are consumed, and the birds, because they said, he shall not see our last end. If thou hast run with the footmen, and they have wearied thee, then how canst thou contend with horses? And if in the land of peace, wherein thou trustest, they wearied thee, then how wilt thou do in the swelling of joy? I want to use the subject this morning, high expectations and low outcomes. High expectations and low outcomes. The call on Jeremiah's life as a prophet proves to have been wrought with difficulty and uncertainty. This narrative illustrates one of the weeping prophet's greatest moments experience. Thus, the first 4 verses of this text, Jeremiah 12, these verses reveal the inward agony of a man, Jeremiah, who pours out his soul to God and expresses his dismay and discontent for the reality of his existence. His discouragement could no longer be hidden. His questions to God reveal the discouragement and perhaps even despair of his innermost being. Jeremiah wants to know why the outcomes of his life are so low when he set out with the expectations that were so high. And I believe all of us can relate to Jeremiah. There are some times that when we look back at a given year, a given period of time that God has allowed us to live, we may have had some highs, we may have been blessed, we may have enjoyed the privileges of God's favor, but there are also times that we recognize that our human experience causes us to have some discouragements. There are times that we are disappointed in people. There are times that we are disappointed in the outcomes of things that we intended to be so much better. If we are to be honest today, there are some times that, like Jeremiah, we need to just pour out ourselves to God and admit to God that sometimes we have some tear-stained pillows, because life is not always about sunshiny days. Sometimes the rain blows, the torrential winds blow our way, and we experience lows when we expected so many highs. Have you ever just been honest and straight up with God? I'm not talking about talking to God from where you should be, but have you ever just been honest and talked with God from where you are? I'm not talking about using big words and fancy phrases, but have you ever come to grips with the fact that there are some things that hurt you, and there are people that hurt you, there are circumstances that hurt you? Have you ever just talked to God about them? Have you ever been honest with yourself and admitted that you are not satisfied with the low outcomes of your life when your hopes, your dreams, your expectations were so much better? There are times in our lives where we need to be honest with God and admit to God that maybe I shouldn't be hurting, but deep down within the core of my being is a hurt that cannot cannot be satisfied by Dr. Phil. Oprah's book club has no book that can deal with my reality. There are some times that in talking to God, we need to just be honest and say, Lord, your servant, your child is hurting, and I just need to be honest with you today. Yeah. Have you ever found yourself frustrated by ungodly behavior in folk who call themselves Christians? Have you ever been fed up with hood brothers in the brotherhood? Have you ever gotten tired of church conflict? Have you ever gotten tired of injustice? Have you ever found yourself fed up with seeing innocent people made to be victims? Are you tired of woes in your marriage? Are you struggling with singlehood? Are you dealing with health challenges? Do you find that your friends are jacked up? Do you find financial hardships? Have you experienced mistreatment on your job? Have you been betrayed? Have you thought that those who had your back were all the way back? You can't see that they got your back. There are sometimes you just need to talk to God and ask God to help you to deal with the reality that you're hurting on the inside when no one else cares, when no one else sympathizes, when no one else empathizes. We need to be able to pour ourselves out to God and ask God to touch us and to sympathize with our situation because we hurt sometimes. Things are not always pretty. We might look good, but it doesn't mean that everything is good. We can spray on cologne and perfume and yet find that our lives are a stinking mess. We can put on our makeup and find that we're just masking the reality of a sad soul within. There are some times that as a child of God, I need to go to God and say, Lord, I'm not talking to you about the stuff I have or the money that I have. I'm talking to you about my spirit that is low. I find myself depleted of joy. My peace is gone. My contentment is on a vacation. There are sometimes I just need to talk to God and know that my God is listening when ain't nobody else listening. That's what we see Jeremiah doing. Jeremiah is known as the weeping prophet. And anytime you deal with God's people, they'll make you weep sometimes. Anytime you're trying to stand for what is right, wrong can be overbearing sometimes. Anytime you're trying to be a servant of light, you're confronted with darkness. When you're trying to give life, death is always behind you. And so sometimes you find that, like Jeremiah, that there are some tears that are justified. And in dealing with that, if we don't ever shed our tears and pour out our hearts to God, we can never get the healing that we need. The healing is not necessarily monetary. It's not necessarily materialistic. But sometimes you just want God to give you some peace in the midst of your storm. And sometimes you just want God to bring some calm in your life. You just want folk to leave you alone. You want trouble to stop troubling you. You want trials to stop trying you. There are some times in our lives where we just are fed up to here. We've had enough and we need God's help. What I find interesting when you study this passage, verses 1 through 4 of Jeremiah chapter 12, is Jeremiah talking to God. Verse number 5 is God responding to Jeremiah. What I find to be so significant in verse number 1, when Jeremiah talks about evil people who are prospering. Verse number 1, he talks about treacherous people who are happy. When God responds in verse 5, he doesn't rebuke evil people for their happiness. He says nothing about treacherous people for their happiness. He says nothing about evil, treacherous people and their prosperity. What he does is he rebukes Jeremiah. And that's an interesting response, that when you look at the evil in other folk, you pray to God and you go down on your knees and you ask God to fix somebody on my job who's mistreating me. Fix my spouse who ain't right. Fix my friends who have betrayed me. Fix my doctor that can't fix me. Fix everybody else. Come on now. It's interesting as God said, Jeremiah, we need to fix you. Jeremiah, I'm not going to deal right now with the evil people who are happy and the treacherous people who are prosperous and the treacherous people who are happy and the evil people that are prospering. But Jeremiah, let's talk about you. See, Jeremiah mentions these verses, these people in verse 1. And then he went on to proclaim in verse number 3 his own righteousness. He says in verse 1, they wrong. In verse 3, I'm right. And we should not look down on him because the objective that he has is to demonstrate the frustration that righteous people have in dealing with evil folk. These verses contrast the hearts of the faithful with that of the unfaithful. But be mindful, however, that much of our own frustration comes from our ability to find fault in others and our inability to take inventory of ourselves. If you ask the average person, who is it that is responsible for your unhappiness? It is my job's fault that I'm unhappy. It is my boss's fault, my co-worker's fault. It's the person who wouldn't marry me. It's the person who married me that ain't acting right. It's the people in the church. It's the attitude I have toward my preacher. It's the attitude I have toward my church members. It's the government. It's the way I see people mistreated. It's always someone else's fault. But when do we take inventory of ourselves? Let me offer you two important principles to close out this year and to help you in next year. Number one, and if you don't remember anything else I say today, I want you to remember this. You cannot experience victory when you are celebrating being a victim. You cannot experience victory when you celebrate being a victim. If you spend your life figuring out why you're the victim and why everybody else is wrong and you right and everybody done you wrong and you deserving of so much more, you will never get victory in your life when you are celebrating being the victim. Second point I want you to remember, you cannot forge ahead when you're stuck in your feelings. As long as you are stuck in your feelings about something, you'll never move ahead. You have to determine that my feelings are not going to define me. That I am not only an emotional creature, I am an intellectual creature. I have the ability to think, to reason, to rationalize, to have inductive and deductive thinking. I have the ability to add to and come to a conclusion. I have the ability to take from and come to a conclusion. And if I stay stuck in my feelings, I'm never going to be able to move ahead because I'm letting my emotions rule me and not letting my mind guide me. You cannot experience victory when you celebrate being the victim, and you cannot forge ahead when you're stuck in your feelings. Think about how we talk sometimes. It helps us to see that we're stuck in our feelings. It helps us to see that we celebrate being victims. We often say stuff like the church ain't right, folk at the church ain't right, the preacher ain't preaching right, the singers ain't singing right, the praying brothers ain't praying right. We say things like, somebody get on my nerves. Well, you get on somebody's nerves too. Then we say stuff like, brother preacher, you ain't from here. St. Louis is just messed up. Ain't no eligible bachelors here. Ain't no good women here. My spouse won't act right. My job doesn't like me. Won't nobody hire me. I need to move because it ain't no opportunity here. Somebody owes me something. The church would grow if we would do this. We need to do that. Listen, as long as you find a reason to complain, all you will ever get is the same thing you've been getting, which is an unhappy spirit. You will never experience any joy, any peace, or any contentment as long as you spend your time finding out what's wrong with somebody else and not taking ownership of yourself. Sometimes we're looking for something and we need to look within ourselves and ask God, not what does he have to say to somebody else, but Lord, what do you have to say to me? When I look at verse 1 and I look at verse number 5, I see a man who is a prophet, who is called by God, one who God says, before I formed you in the womb, I knew you, I ordained you, a prophet for the nations, and yet this very man spends his time in prayer talking to God about what's wrong with somebody else, and God is saying to this man, I need to rebuke not the evil people, not the treacherous people, but Jeremiah, I need to rebuke you. Why does God rebuke Jeremiah? Because he says in verse number 5, Jeremiah, I'm trying to take you to another level. If you can't handle the level you on, you ain't ready for what you think you want. Notice he says, if thou hast run with footmen, why do you allow me to go and have to deal with wicked people? Well, why did you put me in the midst of treacherous people? I gave them my joy. I gave them my contentment. I allowed them to control me. And instead of seeing that God is trying to prepare me, I need to see, I start to say that I'm a victim, and I want to talk to everybody who will listen. And I get happy when people allow me to be the victim because I really think they care for me. Here's what I find to be so baffling about rational, intellectual people. Who allow us to be victims are the folk we love. People who are trying to help us to go to the next level, we shun and can't stand. We are comfortable around dysfunction. And the reason that people are comfortable with dysfunction is if I'm comfortable, it doesn't require me to change. Well. See, as long as we dysfunction, it requires no change in me because I'm around folk that's just like me. Now, if I'm around somebody who's outshining me, it now requires me to have to change. And so what we do is we resort to those who are like us because we're more comfortable with them. The second problem in choosing to be around dysfunction is predictable. See, when you are accustomed to something being wrong, you just get so used to it and know what to expect. But when you start growing, when you start moving, when you are challenged, it requires you to have faith because you don't know what's going to happen. You can't predict the outcomes. So now you have to be challenged within yourself and understand that you can't predict every step, and it's because you can't predict the steps, it's easier to resort back to dysfunction because it least with dysfunction, I know what to expect. But then I want the favor of God, and I don't want to exercise faith. When God responds to Jeremiah, verse 5, he said, Jeremiah, stop crying, stop whining, stop playing the blues. Take ownership of your life. Stop giving people and things the power to take your joy and peace. There are people, no doubt, right now, who ain't got no joy and peace because they let somebody else have it. Yes. Let me ask you to think of some things. Y'all all right? Amen. Let me ask you to think of some things that will help you. To turn to 1 Samuel chapter 15. The first thing that will help you is to stop blaming others. Brother Gibbs or so-and-so, no. Stop blaming other people. A sure way to never get to the next level. Verse 5 of Jeremiah 12 is God saying, Jeremiah, I'm trying to take you to the next level. The surest way to not get to the next level is to blame other people for your unhappiness. Brother Gibbs, I would have favor if it wasn't for so-and-so. I would have this if it wasn't. You've got to stop blaming people for your unhappiness. 1 Samuel chapter 15, verse number 1, the Bible says, Samuel also said to Saul, the Lord sent me to anoint thee to be king over his people, over Israel. Now therefore hearken thou unto the voice of the words of the Lord. Thus saith the Lord of hosts, I remember that which Amalek did to Israel, how he laid in wait for him in the way when he came up from Egypt. Now go and smite Amalek, and utterly destroy all that they have, and spare them not, but slay both man and woman, infant and suckling, ox and sheep, camel and ass. In your Bibles. Now, Samuel said, God wants you to do this. Do you know many times the reason why we lose favor with God is because of something we did not do that we were supposed to do, or something that we did that we should not have done. But we blame everybody else. It's always somebody else's fault. Now go down to verse number 7 in 1 Samuel chapter 15. And Saul smote the Amalekites from Havilah until thou comest to Shur, that is over against Egypt. He's doing all right, ain't he? Verse 8. And he took Agag, the king of the Amalekites, alive, and utterly destroyed all the people with the edge of the sword. He just messed up. Now, what I want you to notice in verse 8, and he took. Y'all see this? Remember that. But Saul and the people spared Agag, and the best of the sheep, and of the oxen, and of the fatlings, and of the lambs, and all that was good, and would not utterly destroy them, but everything that was vile and refuse, that they destroyed utterly. Now here's the problem that happens to us. We start to think we know better than God. God said in verse 3, kill everybody and everything. In verse number 8 and verse number 9, well, God, I think it's some good stuff. So I'm going to spare some of this stuff and some of these people. Let's go to verse number 15. And Saul said, they have brought them from the Amalekites. Now in verse number 8, he. But in verse 15, they. Verse 8, he. Verse 15, they have brought them from the Amalekites, for the people spared the best of the sheep and of the oxen to sacrifice unto the Lord their God, and the rest we have utterly destroyed. Now, notice what he does in verse 15. He blames them for keeping the good stuff, but he includes himself on getting rid of the bad stuff. They brought them from the Amalekites, but we. See, when it's convenient, it's them. When it's convenient, it's them. He manipulates words and he manipulates the reality to fit his seared conscience. Now drop down to verse 23. For rebellion is as the sin of witchcraft, and stubbornness is as iniquity and idolatry. Because thou hast rejected the word of the Lord, he hath also rejected thee from being king. Now, notice what Saul said. They. Now, they is a pronoun that refers to them, a multiple number of people. But God knows English and he knows the language better than anybody because he created the language. So God says in verse 23, I'm going to use some pronouns, but my pronouns will not be plural. They're going to be singular. You said they, but the punishment is to thee. You said them, but you got the problem. You see, sometimes we fall out of favor with God because we spend our time trying to tell God why somebody else is the reason for my unhappiness, and I need to just stop making excuses and take ownership of my choices. That's right. All right. Now, when you get time, you read about David. If you compare Saul and David, there's far more stuff David did wrong than Saul. Yet David experienced so much favor from God. And the chief difference between Saul and David is that David would say, you got me. It was me. David could sing that song, it's me, oh Lord, standing in the need of prayer. Not my brother, not my mother, not my sister, but it's me, oh Lord, standing in the need of prayer. David would say, listen, I am the problem. I made the bad choice that got me the outcomes I got. It ain't nobody else's fault. I'm not going to spend my time celebrating being the victim. I'm not going to spend my time stuck in my emotions. Lord, the problem is me. Because when we don't develop a David response to our sin and we have a Saul response, we get 1 Samuel 15:23, where God said, well, guess what? I reject you. So number one, we need to stop blaming others. Number two, we need to make confession. There's a cliche that says confession, good for the soul. This is not only a cliche, it's rooted in Scripture. In James chapter 5, verse number 16, the Bible says, confess your faults one to another that you may be healed. You know why the Bible tells you to be healed, that you'll be healed in making confession? When you make confession, you get it out your system. You know how much stuff is bottled up in our spirit? You know how much spiritual constipation some of us have? You know, when you're constipated, you make faces. You uneasy. Stuff's tight that you wish was loose. When you don't smile, you don't laugh when you're constipated. And sometimes we have spiritual constipation because we have some stuff in us. See what happens when you have constipation and your body is locked. The waste in your body is poisonous. When you consume food, your body processes food and extracts what it needs. And your body does two things with your food. Number one, the body uses your food as energy. It converts your food into energy. The second thing that your body will do is your body will store food. So your body uses a certain amount of food for energy, and then it stores a certain amount of food. But then the third thing your body does is determine, I don't need this. I'm going to use this, I'm going to store this, and I'm going to get rid of that. So what your body gets rid of is now considered poison to your body. And here's what happens when you're constipated. You can't smile because you've got poison in your system. Now here's another fact that you can go ask a gastroenterologist this, they'll help you to understand. Do you know that if your bowels are not clean, your breath can smell bad? Because what happens is that when that poison is sitting in your bowels and it won't come out where it's supposed to come out, the gases from what's stuck in you will start to backflow. And you can wash your mouth with Listerine, you can brush your teeth, you can do all you want to do, and your breath can still stink because you're constipated. You know why some Christians ain't never happy? You know why what comes out of some Christians' mouths is always stinking? It's because they're spiritually constipated. They got some poison in their spirit. And that's why every time they talk, they raising hell. That's why everything that comes out of their mouth is negative, it's critical. It's because they've got spiritual constipation. It's some stuff they need to get rid of that's poisoning them. They're angry about something. They're bitter about something. They're mad at somebody. Life ain't been good to them. They're blaming everybody, and so they're bagged up. So when the Bible says in James 5, verse number 16, confess your faults one to another that you may be healed, the Bible is saying that you need to get rid of some stuff that is poisoning your system and keeping you from having some joy in your spirit and interrupting your peace and taking from you kind words and a soft tone and a lovely voice, because there's some stuff in you and it may have been in you for years. And you need a colon cleanser to get some stuff out of you. Do you know that blaming and finger pointing never solves your problems? I've never heard a person say, when I found out who to blame, I felt better. Blaming and pointing fingers will not bring you happiness. And then it gives too much control to people who don't have your best at home. There's 7 billion plus people in the world. Why give power to somebody who's demonstrated that they don't have your best interests at home? You can find somebody else to be your friend in a world with 7 billion people. But then, confession is not only good for the soul because it helps to get it out, it helps you to break down pride. You know, a lot of folk don't want folk to know they hurt. A lot of folk don't want folk to know what's going on because we have become so image conscious. And we don't want nobody to know. We don't want nobody to see that I ain't got it all together. We want to know that when I go home, I have to deal with an empty heart. I have to deal with bankrupt feeling. We don't want anybody to see that because I want y'all to think I got it together. When you make confession, it helps you to get rid of that pride. And you worry so much about what folk think about you. And the folk you worried about ain't got their stuff together. See, we in the hospital. All of us sick with something. Everybody ain't got their stuff together. That's why we here. We might be on different floors. Some of us are on the cardiac floor because we ain't got no love in our heart. Some of us are on the kidney floor because we're experiencing renal failure. We can't filter out the mess. So we're dealing with anger and bitterness. Some of us are on the podiatrist floor because we're walking around and our feet ain't right because we walk over people and we walk on people. Some of us are in the mental ward because our spirit ain't right. Y'all with me? Some of us are in the oral care floor because we got oral cancer dripping from our mouths because we just say what we want to say and we feel better because we get it out of our spirits. I'm trying to help us. Some of us need to understand that this ain't about somebody talking about you. This is about somebody praying for you. Somebody talking to God about you. And here's what happens so often. I've seen this all in my ministry. I've seen people come to church and act like they got it together. And you see the cracks. And cracks don't always start off big. It be them hairline cracks. And you see they about to break. And then when they break, they're at crisis level. And when people who have held their pride and don't want nobody to know, I ain't gonna talk to nobody, I don't want nobody in my business, and I'm a private person, Brother Gibbs, I don't tell nobody my business. What they're doing is they're dying from the inside out because they're stressing their bodies, they're stressing their reality. And then when they get to that crisis level, now they want everybody to stand still because they in crisis. But you've been in crisis for the last 5, 10, 20 years, and you wouldn't say nothing because you got pride, and now that you can't handle it no more, now all of a sudden, brother, I ain't coming back to the church because ain't nobody cared about me and my situation. You done had that situation 10 years. And you wouldn't tell anybody about it. Now you come and you have spiritual diarrhea where you let it all out. Now you mad. Let me move on. Let me move on. Number one, you stop making excuses and blaming other people. Number two, you make confession. Number three, and I want to say this to this church, to folk in St. Louis. Now, if I preach somewhere else, I might not be able to use this point in this sermon, but this is a St. Louis point. The reason why this is a St. Louis point is because people keep saying, Brother, you just don't understand St. Louis. These are problems we have in St. Louis. Well, let's talk St. Louis. You cannot apply secular and social solutions to spiritual problems. Amen. You cannot apply the stuff that work on your job. Ain't gonna work in the church. And I don't care how many ice cream socials, movie nights, game nights, card parties, and hanging out you do. That ain't gonna fix church problems. And that's the problem in St. Louis, is we keep applying secular and social solutions to spiritual problems. You know what St. Louis needs? We don't need another ice cream social. We don't need another card party. See, you never have to tell people to socialize. This is what we do as people. It comes natural to us. Until we do two things. We gotta get the Bible and we gotta make confession. Because all we do is, when churches have been hurt, we pacify the hurt with things that make us feel good in the moment, but it never addresses the problem. See, if we all get together and we're watching movies, we're going to have a good time, we're going to laugh. We eat some ice cream, it's going to be good. Ice cream is stimulating, it stimulates the brain, and it makes us feel good. We can play cards, we can talk smack, we can do whatever we want to do, we can have game night. But secular and social solutions do not fix spiritual problems. In Nehemiah chapter 9, they had some problems that caused the walls of Jerusalem to be torn down. The walls and the gates of the city were burned, people died, people were scattered. God sent Nehemiah to help. Nehemiah was in Shushan, the palace. He is the cupbearer to the king. Nehemiah is okay, and the reason that we know he's okay is because of his position. As cupbearer to the king, the last person the king wants unhappy is his cupbearer. Because the cupbearer's job is to drink the wine, taste the food, and make sure that ain't somebody trying to kill the king. Right. So if anybody is to be happy in the king's administration, it is the cupbearer. As a matter of fact, when Nehemiah goes to King Artaxerxes, and the king says to him, "Why is your countenance down?" In other words, I need to know that you okay. Because if you ain't okay, I might not be okay. And so Nehemiah says that something in my spirit ain't right. Because my people in Jerusalem are suffering. The walls of the city, the gates of the city have been torn down, they've been burned, they've been destroyed. Jerusalem is not a fortified city. And he says, I want permission to have a leave of absence so that I can go down to Jerusalem and I can serve as a project manager. And we can put the walls back together. We can put the gates back together. We can restore the fortified city of Jerusalem. But Nehemiah also understood that the real problem was not the walls, the gates of Jerusalem. The real problem was spiritual. Because the reason why the walls were torn down and the gates of the city were burned and Jerusalem was no longer a fortified city is because God's people had sinned. And he understood that you cannot fix sin problems with social and secular solutions. If we want to fix St. Louis, we don't need a good. If we want to fix St. Louis, we don't need a preacher to tickle us. If we want to fix St. Louis, it's not about playing cards and drinking and having ice cream and movie nights and all that other stuff. If we want to fix St. Louis, we need a spiritual solution. What's the spiritual solution? In Nehemiah chapter 9, in verse number 2 of Nehemiah chapter 9. Y'all all right? The Bible says, and the seed of Israel separated themselves from all strangers. See, sometimes God's people, we need to go on a retreat. And not because of the destination. See, when I say retreat, it'd be good if we have a retreat in Hawaii. It'd be good if we can go to Cancun. We can go to Jamaica. Now, we need a retreat where we